Welcome to your Aged Care Compass podcast. Join us to find out how to support your older loved ones at home. We're going to help you make sense of Australia's aged care system. We talk about legal and financial considerations for ageing and how chronic health conditions impact your older loved ones' well-being. And we share real-life stories of where it went wrong for people and how we got them back on track.
Hi everyone. It's great to have you back for our next episode of Your Aged Care Compass. Last week, I spoke with Dr. Kylus Roberts, a Brisbane-based psychiatrist with a special interest in dementia. This topic was in response to you, our followers, asking for an episode on dementia. We've also been asked about support for people with dementia and their families, how to communicate with someone who has dementia, and a very broad question about what else should families consider when caring for a loved one with dementia. Given there is so much to discuss regarding this topic, there'll be 2 episodes, today and next week, where our guest, Laura Stasinowsky, and I talk about how an occupational therapist can support people who have dementia. Laura is an occupational therapist, commonly called an OT, and dementia consultant who is passionate about supporting people to live well with dementia. She has more than 10 years of experience in the field of dementia, and she has also personally experienced the impact of dementia within her own family. Laura works within the Your Brain in Mind clinic in Brisbane. She supports people at any stage of their journey with dementia, working with both the individuals who are diagnosed with dementia and their families. Laura, when we talk to older people about aged care and occupational therapists, most people tend to think of a home safety assessment or an assessment for mobility aids. But you're specifically working with people with dementia and their families. Could you explain the role of an OT with a person who has dementia?
Thanks, Coral. I'm really excited to be talking with you today about my area of passion. Let me start by first explaining the OT role quite broadly. Occupational therapy is quite an unfamiliar health profession, unfortunately for me. This is unless they or someone close to them has received occupational therapy services before. But even then, their understanding is typically limited to their specific experience. For example, they might have had a child who has autism and had OT for that. Or they might have had someone who's had a stroke and an occupational therapy has helped with rehabilitation for that. When we as OTs talk about occupations, we're referring to any of those meaningful activities that one does in day-to-day life. This could be anything from shopping, cooking, cleaning, bathing, to working, playing golf, socializing, and everything in between. When a person experiences health challenges, whether these be mental or physical, whether these be from an accident or an acquired health condition, this impacts upon all of those day-to-day activities. Put simply, we as OTs work out ways to support people to do whatever activities they need or want to do within their life. What we actually do with each client, though, is uniquely tailored to them. However, we're always aiming to maximise a person's overall quality of life.
So that's occupational therapy in general, Laura. What about OT specifically in the context that you work in?
When working with people with dementia and their families, I still take this very holistic and tailored approach, but this is obviously in the context of a dementia diagnosis. So some specific examples may be that I'm helping a family understand what a diagnosis of dementia means for them, and also helping them prepare for the future. I know Dr. Kylus Roberts spoke a bit in detail with you recently about some of those different types of dementia.
Yes.
So sometimes the doctor hasn't had a chance to properly explain all of this to the person, their family, and so I can help unpack that. And often people have lots of questions, so helping them with that as well. And helping prepare for the future. So that might be, making sure that they've thought about substitute decision makers, potentially things like advanced healthcare directives, accommodation, care arrangements, things like that. But I always like to bring it back to the present. So make sure we have a plan for the future, but then come back to the present and maximizing that.
Yeah.
I also may help people work out ways to improve their safety and independence, whether that be at home or out and about in the community. And sometimes that might be as simple as labeling kitchen cabinets if they're forgetting where different items are, or it could be something a bit more complex like prescribing grab rails in the bathroom to help with safety during showering.
Yep.
I also can prescribe equipment to make life a bit easier. That could be, small pieces of equipment which might help someone get their shoes and socks on and off, or it could be larger pieces of equipment like a wheelchair to help with mobility. I can also assist with stress management, whether that be for the person that has the diagnosis or their family. Usually there's different kinds of stresses being experienced, and also grief is a big thing that pops up, anticipatory grief, complicated sort of grief, and help people work through that. If it's anything more sort of complicated than I feel equipped to work with, I'll definitely refer on and say, I'd recommend going to see a psychologist. And we have one of those in our team at the Brain and Mind Clinic, and I'll refer to her whenever I feel that's, going to be really important for someone. I can also work with families to work out strategies to managing those changes in behaviour, which are quite typical for people with dementia. So it could be something like the person's repetitively asking the same question, or they stop halfway through what they're doing and they can't complete that task that they used to, and that task's really, important to them. It might be they want them to be able to, still shower as independently as possible. There's certain elements that the person with dementia is sort of struggling with at that point in time. It might be sleep disturbances, and obviously that affects both the person who's experiencing dementia and those associated sleep disturbances. But when their sleep's disturbed, it's also going to impact upon other people living in that same home. Could be things like the person is, just walking out the front door, not really aware of any safety concerns with traffic. And so something else that I'd work with them to sort of manage. But there's lots of different bits and bobs that I can work with people on. It's just so broad. There's so many different examples. But really, what I do with each person is completely dependent upon their unique situation. So if you've got someone who is using a wheelchair all the time, I'm obviously not going to be having the conversation about, needing some sort of potentially GPS system to ensure that the loved one is sort of kept safe with regards to the walking out of home or, getting lost in the community or anything like that. So very much listening to what the client I'm working with needs, and it usually isn't just one person. Coral is often the person with dementia plus their spouse plus a child and whoever else is in the mix. So it's really important to weigh up all those different sort of factors, because sometimes something that you think would work really well for one person is actually going to have a negative impact on the other person.
Yes.
So there's a lot of complexity that comes with that. The other thing to note that adds the complexity is that, as we know, a lot of people with dementia are old adults. And as we go through life, we acquire different health conditions, unfortunately. And so when I'm working with people with dementia, it's not uncommon for them to have a variety of other health conditions. People don't exist in an isolated box just with a diagnosis of dementia.
No.
So I'm often working with these people with dementia, with all their other health conditions also in consideration. So that might seem really complex, and sometimes it is, but I try to keep it as simple as possible by focusing on the fact that I'm working to understand and address the person's unique needs. So I really listen to the person and go, all right, this is what I'm hearing, reflect it back, confirm that that's what I understand is correct, and then work with them from that point onwards, and making sure that I'm working with the person first and foremost, not the diagnosis of dementia or any other health condition. They're all secondary factors.
Fantastic. My goodness, I bet your caseload of lovely clients keeps you on your toes, Laura. I mean,
yes.
a complex condition with all its associated complexities, behaviours, and then tailoring the person's plan of care to their individualised needs what a specialised role that you have supporting older people with dementia and their families. That's incredible.
And when you've got younger people, Coral, it can have another type of complexity. If you've got someone who's got a young family, that is so different, you know, when you're working with them versus someone who has fully grown children with their own children who are then able to provide support. And it's just a totally different dynamic, the whole family unit. And so, yeah, I really have to shift lenses sometimes and sort of focus on different aspects depending on, whatever that unique situation is before me.
It must be very interesting. I'm fascinated by what you've just said, Laura. Just no day would be the same, would it?
No, it is not. Stretches my brain, keeps me on my toes, that's for sure.
So, look, you mentioned Dr. Kylis Roberts, who we had on the show last week about diagnosing dementia. So, what should happen next in terms of supporting a person from point of diagnosis? As an OT, how would you support a person and their family to understand what dementia is and what the diagnosis means for them and their family?
So first, I usually start out by finding out what the person and their family already know and then gently correcting any misconceptions that might come up.
Mm-hmm.
I'll then, as they're ready, talk through the big picture of dementia. So that could include what dementia is, how it progresses, and what this means for them specifically. So thinking about their living arrangements, care arrangements, things that they currently are doing that are going to shift and change, etc. If they've been given a specific diagnosis, such as, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, Alzheimer's disease, then we can talk about the specific details related to those as well. Sometimes I'll also utilize resources from reputable organizations to support these discussions. But most importantly, through all these discussions, throughout the whole process, I'll facilitate opportunities for the person and their family to ask questions. And this is both in those initial stages, post-diagnosis, and in an ongoing manner across the whole journey, because people are always learning more about what it means for them. And often as well, if not more importantly, is the fact that early on it can be so overwhelming for people. You don't, and that's why I said when people are kind of ready, I give them information, because I've had situations where I have a son sometimes and a wife of this gentleman who has dementia, and the wife is not ready. This is a legitimate situation I've had. The wife is saying, I kind of want support, but I don't want you to tell me what the future holds. Sure. And then I have the son, he has some medical background, but he doesn't understand dementia. And he's like, no, I want you to tell me the full picture. And so it's really tricky sometimes to work with people through that stage of, I guess, information giving, because there's certain things that aren't going to make sense that I will recommend unless they have certain information already there. For example, if I'm recommending a more expensive wheelchair that has tilted space function, for example, and the person that I'm working with doesn't understand that as a result of dementia, that person's going to need more postural support. They're not going to be able to sit upright independently. We haven't had that conversation about the physical effects of dementia. They're only thinking about the stuff in the mind. That's not going to make any sort of sense at all to them as to why I would recommend a more expensive piece. I'm thinking about the long-term picture, and this is the most cost-effective solution, because we're, if the person lives long enough, we're going to need this.
Yes.
But yeah, it's just the timing of when you give bits of information is just so important, because I know sometimes people, I've gone, I know they're already sort of struggling, but if I don't give them at least this a little bit of extra and push them gently to get that assessment under my aged care, like a home care package. So they're in the process of about to change this, Coral, but as you know, they've got the ACAT assessment. So sometimes I push people to kind of get the ACAT assessment done. And then later they've gone, in the moment I felt overwhelmed by it, but then I was so glad that you did give me that little nudge to do that, or that you did say, okay, I know it's not nice to think about, but go and suss out those sort of aged care homes, have a little look at what's out there, because you never know when things might change, even for respite support. So there's always a lot going on in my mind when people come to me post-diagnosis. First of all, I need to, work out where they're at with their basic understanding, but also that level of coping, like where are they at in the moment? Because you're probably well aware yourself, Coral, if we're not coping, if we're not, sleeping well because we're really stressed, if we've already been overburdened with a lot of information, any extra information that someone gives us just goes right over our head. And a health professional might think, oh, great, we've covered it, tick. But actually none of that information was absorbed. And so it was just a waste. And you probably just added more burden instead of helping them. So sometimes it's actually about putting some of those tougher conversations to the side for a little bit until the family is in a better
They're ready.
spot.
Yeah. I'm really glad you just spoke about the case with the wife and the son there, and the specialty, the expertise that an OT such as yourself can offer in that situation, because like we've already discussed, in the aged care sector, people tend to think of OTs as prescribing equipment and mobility aids. And so I think what that represents in this scenario is that, sure, you could get a generalist OT in to do that, but if the older person has dementia, you really need to be seeking out a specialist OT for exactly the reasons that you've said. Like, wheelchairs are not inexpensive, and if you have a home care package and you've purchased a wheelchair and then realise it's 6 months, 12 months down the track, actually it's not going to be suitable, that additional cost that someone will have to outlay, that could have been addressed had they had someone such as yourself looking into the future and planning for that, even though you might not be saying that at the time. I think what you've just said reveals to me that it's not a one-off conversation. And if you do have a loved one that's diagnosed with dementia, it's worth seeking out an OT such as yourself who works in this space to plan for the future and to have that ongoing support. It's not just a one-off conversation and see you later.
Yeah, because that awareness, Coral, of what the future holds is like so important to sort of be able to walk with people through it and then be able to incrementally give them what they need based on what you're seeing and hearing. Because, if I have experience working as a carer for 4 years in aged care before I became an OT, and that experience has been so valuable. It's so priceless, because I'm like, okay, I'm seeing these little things and I know from my experience that there's probably a lot happening behind the scenes. I'm only here for, an hour with this client, and I'm hearing this from the family member. I'm seeing this when I'm present, but I'm fully aware that there's lots of other things that are happening behind the scenes. Even with my family, we had, a grandparent, and so husband and wife were together. The wife, she got dementia. Husband was the primary carer, but he kept saying, everything's okay, everything's okay. And I was going, from what I am seeing, there's a lot more happening behind the scenes. I'm not so sure everything's okay. But because he was trying to, be strong and just, do the best that he could, and he didn't want to probably add stress to the family, he just kept going until he couldn't anymore, and he hit the wall. And the problem was the family weren't aware of everything that had been happening, and then it took a while to bring people on the same page. And so, in those early stages post-diagnosis, that's another important thing they do with people, is making sure that if they've got 3 children, that they're, especially if they're enduring powers of attorney, and it depends on the family dynamics, but usually people want their children to be in the picture. And if one person thinks that, oh no, mum and dad, they're perfectly fine, like it'll be years away until, anything significant shifts and changes, then they're going to be fighting against certain recommendations. Like if, for example, you might have, like in my family, for example, husband, he was saying, look, I can't cope. I'm looking into residential aged care options. And two of the daughters, they couldn't see it. They didn't know the full extent of everything. And they're going, I don't know, it's too early. We'll just provide a bit of extra support at home. That'll be fine. Like, we'll just come by a couple of days in the week and therefore mum can stay at home. And it wasn't until we unpacked everything that was going on and they could also deal with their sort of grief through what was happening that they then could realize, oh, actually, it's past that point. We need to also look after their dad, not just mum, because sometimes people get so focused, Coral, on the person with the diagnosis and they miss, I know we're going a bit off on a tangent here, but we miss the other people that are being affected too. Like dementia doesn't just affect the individual, it affects that whole community around them. And so, that's one thing I'm really passionate about is making sure that we don't lose sight of that community around them by focusing so much on just that person with diagnosis. Because if you've got their primary support person, the carer, and their health then goes downhill as well, and you've got two unwell people, that's not ideal.
Crisis. No,
that's not ideal. And so, there's just so much that I guess I am considering post-diagnosis, Coral, and there's no one size fits all approach.
No.
FlexiCare is a not-for-profit organisation which supports older people living in Brisbane's southern suburbs to live their best lives in their own homes and communities. FlexiCare don't have grand plans to be the biggest aged care provider. They want to be known for treating each one of their participants as an individual who they get to know well. They answer their phone calls personally when clients ring them. They give their clients easy access to a home care partner who can work with them to deliver the best mix of support possible. If you're in Brisbane South and want to know more, give their friendly team a call on 07 3422 8400 or check out their website flexi.org.au.
So, Laura, we hear in our work that people are reluctant to progress a diagnosis as they're afraid it will mean big changes to their lifestyle, such as having to stop driving. But this isn't the case, is it? If a person was worried about seeing their doctor because they were afraid they'd be told to stop driving, what would you advise them?
Yes, this can be a real tricky one, Coral. My advice would be to still talk with their doctor and get checked out. Even if you're diagnosed with dementia, this does not mean that you will suddenly have to give up your license. At some point in the future, this will likely eventuate, particularly if reflecting on those things that Dr. Roberts sort of spoke through, you kind of understand the significant changes that do occur and how that will impact on safety. But a person only needs to cease driving if there is a concern for their or others' safety on the roads. So a diagnosis of dementia does not automatically mean one has to stop driving. In fact, getting an early diagnosis of dementia may enable you to get the right support and medication to help you stay driving for as long as possible. So it's a bit of a win-win there. And further to this, you may not even have dementia. You might be stressing about something that isn't the case, which is actually going to impact your health more negatively than going through the process and finding out what's actually going on. And, to add to that, you might have another condition that is actually far more treatable, and you would want to put off that. If there's something that you're experiencing and you can get checked out and a doctor can go, oh, actually, it's this condition and here's what you need to do to fix it. You've stopped the symptoms that you're experiencing, or at least lessened them, and hopefully stop something progressing any further. So it's not just dementia that people need to be thinking of as well.
That's right.
And if there are concerns with safety, then health professionals being aware of how important driving is, they aren't going to take a decision like that lightly. And it isn't something, Coral, that just gets revoked. The license doesn't just automatically get revoked when someone has such a diagnosis.
Brilliant. Thank you for clarifying that, Laura. Do you find that there's still a perception of social stigma with people being diagnosed, that they don't want to tell anyone about their diagnosis of dementia? And if you were supporting someone in this position, what would you say to reassure them?
Sadly, people still fear the social stigma, and this fear of potential judgment can actually be more limiting than the symptoms they're experiencing at the time. if I was supporting someone who was tossing up whether or not to share their diagnosis, I'd really emphasize the fact that they get to choose who they tell and how much they tell about that. And I'd also like to encourage them to talk to people and let them know that they're probably going to be really surprised by how supporting and accepting others are of their diagnosis. And sometimes it actually helps people know how to respond, to you better, because then they go, oh, I didn't realize, like, how can I help?
Yes.
Instead of people thinking potentially negative things about so-and-so is intentionally doing this or that. If they go, oh, actually, this person has a condition, they're trying the best that they can, better sort of outcomes can result from that. And personally, I believe that the more people openly share their diagnosis and also, the journeys that come along with that, with dementia, the less social stigma there will be. So we keep spreading this message, but it takes time, Coral, and the more brave people that step out and share, I think that will beget more and more people doing the same.
Exactly. I wholeheartedly agree with you, Laura. I think speaking about it, sharing your experiences, I know there is still some stigma out there, but I think the level of acceptance now and understanding across the broader community is better than it ever was before.
Yeah. And you might be surprised by how many people say, yeah, me too.
Yes.
And then you can support each other through the journey.
Yeah. Yep. So we've been asked to ask you how to communicate with a person with dementia. Does the level of cognitive impairment dictate how you should communicate with someone who has dementia? And what should people be aware of?
Oh, Coral, this is a bit of a loaded question. We could do a whole podcast, I think, just on communication.
Maybe we will.
Yeah. It's something I'm quite passionate about as well, because communication is so essential. So, along with most of the other things I've been saying to you today, it needs to be tailored to the individual. So, to give you a bit of a pragmatic sort of situation, if you have someone who has poor vision versus someone who has poor hearing, you're going to change the way that you communicate with them, especially when you overlay that with the symptoms of dementia.
Yep.
However, some more basic principles for people to keep in mind would be to, communicate clearly and respectfully. One of my pet peeves is when people talk to people with dementia as if they're a child. And it's like, yes, they're experiencing challenges with their cognition, but they're not a child. They've lived usually pretty marvelous lives to that point, and they still deserve that respect. And if you don't treat them with respect, people with dementia, they're still going to pick up on that. They're not silly. They're going to feel that you aren't respecting them, and that's obviously going to probably result in communication from them coming back not so positively, and things can kind of snowball from there. Also, just giving people more time is really important, Coral, because I'm hoping with Dr. Roberts' podcast that got the chance to explain that the brain, because of all the changes, things are slowing down.
Yes.
And so the person previously may have come back to you really quickly with a response. However, now with the dementia progressing, they might need up to 10 seconds to formulate a response. And maybe you're looking for more nonverbals than for verbal communication. And the same thing thinking about yourself. People with dementia will often find that verbal communication becomes a bit more challenging, and quite often people with dementia will get to the point where they're no longer able to consistently communicate with words to you. And also the understanding of what verbally is being told to them can also be a challenge, particularly if you've got someone where the language you're using is not their first language.
Right.
So if you've got someone who had their first language as Spanish, as dementia progresses, they're most likely to revert back to Spanish and lose what they've learned of the English language. And so for that sort of a situation, it would be great if you had someone who speaks Spanish, but if you don't, you're going to be relying more on those non-verbals. You might have some, communication cards with words written down and things like that as well. But non-verbals, even in the situation where someone has English as their first language, because of that processing of the verbal language becoming more challenging. People with dementia tend to look at the non-verbal cues a lot more. And even in, communication, I don't know what the percentages are, Coral, but I know they say like tone and body language actually means far more or has far more influence than the verbal words that people speak.
Right.
And so we need to pay particular attention to this when communicating with someone with dementia, because, if we're thinking they've asked this 10 times already and you're getting frustrated, your body language is showing that you're getting frustrated, your tone is sounding frustrated, but the person with dementia is completely unaware that they've asked this question that many times, in their mind, this person is just getting frustrated at them for a good reason.
Yeah.
And so really stressing with communication is you need to put yourself into the shoes of the person with dementia. So you've got to first understand what dementia is, what's happening in the brain, and also thinking about that person's personal sort of history as well, because there's certain things about people that, because of their history, there's things that can be quite triggering. It might be certain phrases, or even I've had people who have, this is off on a bit of a tangent, I apologize, Coral, but I've had people who have been in the wars and they aren't meaning to be racist. However, certain people, like we had carers that were coming that were Japanese, and unless that person had warning, they would have a bit of a PTSD response. Yes. And so that wasn't specifically as a result of dementia. It was actually the PTSD overlaid with that. But then if they don't know, the staff or the family don't know that history about the person, and the person with dementia has lost the ability to communicate that other than what they're feeling in the present moment, that's obviously going to make communication really sort of challenging. So sometimes with communication, it's actually things prior to even having that direct communication that's really important. So even thinking about, do I have a TV on in the background or a radio on in the background? Thinking about, I don't know if Kyla spoke about changes in vision that can occur, particularly in Alzheimer's.
No, he didn't.
So they know that people with Alzheimer's in the later stages often lose their peripheral vision. So one thing that I've taught people is if you're not really getting much of a response and you're standing side on, you probably need to make sure that you're coming much more front on. But you don't want to be right, in their personal space.
Yeah.
But, thinking about, again, off on a little tangent, sorry, Coral, but all these practical case studies.
Fantastic. I love hearing this.
To mind. I was an OT in a residential aged care home, and this carer was complaining that this person with dementia in bed, fairly progressed dementia, basically ate nothing. And I thought, that's interesting. Can you show me how you were attempting to assist this person with eating? They'd positioned their chair right beside the person's bed, side on, and just coming in from the side. And I said, can I just try something? So I grabbed a spoon, I positioned myself, I came down, sat towards her foot end of the bed and made sure I was in her line of vision.
Line of sight, yeah.
And then, slowly brought the spoon to her mouth. And, explain what I was doing, talk through. And then she was quite happy to take the spoon and eat. Thinking about what I said before, putting yourself in the shoes of the person with dementia, if you are aware that this person's lost peripheral vision and that they've now got this weird sensation of something touching their lip and they can't see what it is, and potentially no one's verbally told them what's happening either, would you, Coral, open your mouth if you had some weird metal thing with no explanation?
No, I would not. No.
Exactly.
Wow.
So, because communication, when I think about it, is not just, verbal. There was important communication that was needing to happen in that, feeding, assisting to eat moment. But it wasn't happening because the person, that carer, just didn't know. They just weren't aware of the fact that that person had likely lost peripheral vision and to try a different approach. It was a fairly simple change, but it made a world of difference.
What a big impact. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And so, also just making sure you have, people's attention before you, speak to them. There's a lot happening in people's brains normally. And then when you've got dementia, things can be more challenging to filter. So if you say something to them and it just gets lost in amongst all the other bits of information that are out there in their environment, that's not going to be too helpful either. And even just making sure that you're using as positive as possible sort of body language. So, Coral, if you had someone that was trying to, I don't know, coach you to go in a certain direction, but they look grumpy and you weren't very familiar with them, do you think you'd be likely to go with them?
No, I would not. I would want to go back to the safety of my room.
Yeah. So thinking about, okay, in this moment, what's the most reassuring thing for this person? And, another stories come to mind. So I had a lady, the importance of people's history was just, so
Essential.
clear in this. Yeah. This lady grew up in London. And there, I don't know what it was, but there were a couple of days where she was talking about the bombs, and she was terrified.
Right.
And I was aware, she was in London at the point where bombs were literally being dropped.
Yes.
So in that moment, the communication, it wouldn't have mattered how lovely I was. Her reality, it was so important. I understood her reality to be able to communicate clearly to her. So there were no bombs in the reality that I was living in, but in her reality, there was. So, Coral, if you had bombs being dropped on you right now and someone just came up to you and said, Coral, it's all okay. Don't worry, there aren't any bombs. How would you respond?
Well, I wouldn't believe them because my reality is, well, can't you see the bombs? Can't you hear the bombs?
Yeah, haven't you heard the news or whatever?
Terrifying.
And so, okay, I thought, well, this is her reality. I don't believe in lying people, but I will step into their reality. So guess what I did? I said, look, I know where there's somewhere safe we can go. Come with me where the bombs can't get you. Yeah, the bombs couldn't get her. We walked to the next destination that I actually wanted her to go to, which is like the memory node that we called it. So where people were doing activities for the day. And she happily, came with me. But I basically reflected back some of the emotion she was. So she was a bit scared. So I was like, I'm just as concerned as you are. Come with me. Let's go. That was what she needed to actually move through
Feel
that.
Safe. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So often people think about the communication as just being, what you're saying or
the verbal dialogue. Yeah.
But it's not. Like, you've got to really think about their reality. Otherwise, your communication can be so mismatched to what that person actually needs. And obviously, that person had more sort of progressed dementia, but things are going to continue to change with the person with dementia. So even strategies that you used previously to communicate with the person, they're going to need to shift and change as condition progresses. Yeah. So you may have been able to do more of that verbal dialogue, and as things progress, it's more of the visuals and more of those sort of tactile cues. But I had another situation, again, another little mini case study, Coral, where, sometimes a time out is super important. Okay. So I had a lady and she was really cross with me, and I'd previously had a really good relationship with her. I knew this lady had really poor short-term memories. If I didn't know this lady, this move that I'm about to tell you would have been rather risky. But because I knew her really well, it worked a charm. So she was really cross with me. There was nothing I was saying or doing that was helpful. She was in her own sort of unit. So I literally just said, I'll come back later, shut the door, stood outside, communicated with one of the other carers about some other things. A couple minutes later, walked back in. Good morning, Betty. How are you today? Just completely pretended that none of that prior stuff had happened. And we were having a good day. And she switched. Oh, how are you?
Fantastic.
And I was like, oh. But Coral, imagine if that was you and you didn't have that poor short-term memory loss and some family member tried that on you.
Exactly.
You would be more cross.
Exactly. So easy to get off on the wrong foot there. I think that is such a brilliant scenario and a tip that you've given for our listeners to try just with their own older loved ones, Laura.
And the thing is, it's a dance, Coral. The thing is, people sometimes worry about doing the exact right thing, but often there isn't. And you try different things. If it doesn't work, you try something else and maybe I won't do that again. There's just constant sort of learning and adapting that happens. And I think sometimes people are so fearful about getting it wrong. And I just like to, reassure people that you're doing the best that you can. That's all anyone can ask. If you need support, there's support out there. And, we can work through what we can maybe do a bit differently to hopefully see some better results. But if you're keeping things simple, if you're keeping things as positive as possible, if you're giving adequate time for them to sort of pause and process and then respond back to you, you can't go too far wrong. So, if you're doing things with care behind it, the person's going to pick up on that.
Fantastic. Wonderful, wonderful tips, Laura. We covered a lot of ground in this episode, Laura. We've talked about the role of an occupational therapist and how an OT can support people with dementia and their families. We've talked about the impact the diagnosis may have on day-to-day activities, specifically driving. We've talked about stigma, and you've given us an in-depth approach to communicating with people with dementia. All big topics relating to dementia. We'll conclude this episode here, and we'll be back next week to continue talking about the role of an OT in dementia. Listeners, I hope you'll join us again next week. We'll be talking about the misconception that we see across social media, being mum and dad are pretending to have worse memory problems than they do. We're going to be talking about stress, sundowning, and knowing when to think about moving a loved one into residential care. Laura, thank you for such an enlightening conversation. I'm really looking forward to continuing this chat next week. Until then, listeners, take care.
Hey Care community, thanks for listening to this episode. So you never miss a show, make sure you subscribe to our podcast. If you'd like to know more about what we do, head to our website, cmeacn.com.au.